to Perivale Wood. Welcome to another broadcast here for 30 Days Wild. So for those who've not followed all these, 30 Days Wild is a little project that is set up by the wildlife trusts here in the United Kingdom, and it's just about encouraging people every day in June, of which there are 30 of course, to pay attention to something wild around them, something about the natural world around them. So I'm trying to do a little bit of content online, here on YouTube, a few things on Twitter every day during June for that. And I thought what we'd do today is just have a fairly gentle wander around Perivale Wood, a nature reserve here in northwest London that I'm involved in running and managing and looking after. So we'll go for a wander, we'll see what there is to see, if anything. I've got to turn the camera around so we're looking into it, and we'll go in and have a quick look and see what, if anything, there is to see today. So it's rather overcast at the moment. It was quite sunny earlier this morning. It was much warmer earlier this morning. Temperature's probably dropped about 4 or 5 degrees since when I left the house at about 10:30. We had a bit of rain, and this little heat wave we've been having here in, well, certainly the southern part of the United Kingdom seems to have finished. Just yesterday, just down the road at Heathrow, it was over 32 degrees centigrade, which is certainly warm for here. Today it's probably just about 20, maybe a bit less, and the breeze coming out the northeast is a little bit cooler. That's quite a change in conditions over the course of effectively 24 hours. But that's weather for you. And it does make a difference to what you see. And butterflies are certainly much less active today than they would have been yesterday, although I wasn't able to get out here yesterday to check. There's one of our little yew trees. A very toxic plant, yew. Pretty much any part of it will do you a lot of damage if you eat it. But rather an attractive evergreen, and has a few specialist insects that can manage to feed on it. We're just going to quickly pop in here and check this building here, where I am rearing through a few different invertebrates, moths primarily, but almost entirely moths. See if anything has done anything. Got nothing larval at the moment, but we've got a few things that are pupa. So as you can see, there's a pupa in there, and this one appears to actually have emerged. Closed, as the term is. So we'll have a quick look and see what this species is. This is a emerging cage, a rearing cage essentially. Net. Where is the insect? Where is it? I saw it a moment ago. Well, down there is the pupa exuvia. Let's see. There it is. Okay. And then over here, it's a bit difficult to get the camera in. Let's try this. There, possibly you can see, is the moth, which is it's actually a bright line brown eye. Common enough species. But I found the pupa of this buried lightly in the ground underneath a log. So I didn't know what species it was from the pupa. Identifying invertebrates from what their pupa look like is a real challenge. Probably impossible in many cases. So I kept this to rear it on and see what it is. And there is what it is, a bright line brown eye. I'll seal that up again so I can come and take some proper photographs of it later. But that's always good to see how these things have emerged. Everything else is not emerged, not closed. is still in its pupal stage, so we'll leave that for now. And we'll go for a wander further through the wood and see what else there is to see. See, all the trees are really in full leaf now, and it's quite dark therefore down at the woodland floor layer, and that's why there's relatively little now growing actively down here at the ground level. There are the seed heads here of the bluebells, and people who've seen my broadcasts earlier in the year will have seen this woodland when the floor was a carpet of blue flowers, and all of them now have pretty much finished flowering. We might find one or two that are really late as we go around, but they're now producing their seed heads. They're now doing their production of the next generation, and those seeds will spread. They don't spread very far, and some of them will take and form new flowers, but mainly these plants will spread by splitting of the bulbs. They're a bulb plant. The bulbs split and they gradually expand vegetatively from there, but they also reproduce by seed, and the seed can be dispersed. When it dries out a little bit more, these seed pods will go brown and crack open and the seeds will fall out. So you can see how all of those bluebells have really finished their flowering early in the spring, when there was light coming through, and they've finished, they've really finished their photosynthesizing for the year. All their leaves are gone. They've got their energy, they've stored it away in those bulbs, and they're just now getting their seeds dispersed and then shutting themselves down for really the rest of the year, until next spring when they can come on again. More plants here. Plants are not things I'm always good at identifying plants, so little yellow plant with 5. Trick the focus by holding it this way. 5 petals and so on, and leaves like that. I'm not sure which plant this is. I'm not very good on many plants, but rather attractive. A little bit of colour down here at the floor level. Which way shall we go today? Let's go left today. You can see here one of our oak trees that's rather the worse for wear, perhaps getting a bit old, perhaps getting a bit damaged, but that's its leaves in sort of, not quite the foreground, but you can see it's still producing leaves. It is still alive, but it's lost a lot of bark, and a lot of the branches are bare and not producing leaf. But there's still some life to it, and of course that rotting wood and breaking down dead material is all interesting, all habitat. And then the other plant, which is a lot in here, is this. This is hazel, and that's the main understory tree that we have here. So the oaks that we were looking at, they form the canopy. In the main, they form up there, the top, the cover, the thick layer. And then the trees below, the main one we have is hazel, which produces these leaves and later on produces hazelnuts, of course. There are plenty of other things. And then sort of at the bottom of the sort of floor layer, there are various things. The bluebells we were looking at. We've got bramble flowers here, or blackberry flowers. Nicely out in flower, a nice nectar source for various insects. Of course, the bramble can be a can be quite a problematic species. It is native here, but it can take over large swathes of the area and shade out everything else on the floor. So to some extent we control it. We certainly cut some of it out and spread some of it out, but we're very happy to have bramble here. It's a native plant, important part of the ecosystem. And another plant that is native but which has really expanded its population here is holly. Nice spiky leaves. And this again is a species that previously was sufficiently worth noting in this reserve that somebody mapped where every single holly was. I think that was about the 1970s they did that. Whereas now it is present in a lot of the reserve, in a lot of areas, and again it can really dominate. Very thick, very dark leaves, very dark cover, very much shades out everything below it. So when the hollies get going, they can again change the dynamic of the wood. So again, this is a plant we're not trying to eliminate, but we're trying to control the numbers of, keep it down to a more manageable level, to keep that light levels down at the ground a bit better, and keep some different plants from there. One of our rustic benches. We try to avoid having chairs in here that look like obvious park benches and go for things that are more rustic in design, like these. But for our visitors, we do try to make sure there's places people can have a sit down if they're wandering around, have a rest. But we hear a bit of bird song going. I'm not particularly going to try and point out all of the bird song, but the two-tone note one is a chiff-chaff, arguably singing chiff-chaff, chiff-chaff. You might be able to hear that. The other quite noisy thing are the ring-necked parakeets. It's a non-native species that's been put here. And down here, is it going to stay there as we get closer? We've got a wasp collecting wood to mash up and make paper to form its nest. If it behaves itself, I might be able to see what species of wasp it is. Need to have a look at the front of the face to do that. We briefly saw the front of the face. That was a common wasp, or Vespula vulgaris, which is the commonest wasp species we seem to have. Certainly that sort of black and white stripy stingy type of wasp, the commonest of the species we have here. I don't really study wasps to know some of the more tricky to identify groups and survey what they are here, partly because the literature to identify them is quite hard to get and quite expensive, and partly because there's just a limited amount of hours in the day and things that you can learn. So along the edge here, where we have lots and lots of suckering elm regrowth. So these are all small elms, probably maybe a year old, maybe 2 years old. I think 2 here. And we manage these areas around the edge of the wood deliberately by cutting on a 4 or 5 year cycle to keep a fairly young edge, but keep different blocks at different ages. So you can see a more mature block behind this one where the plants are taller. And one of our meadows, and you can see our team of meadow management here for cows who are was grazing the meadows for us and helping keep the grasses down and provide space for some of the plants and flowers and the other things to grow. Having a bit of a rest now. It's quite a warm day, probably quite hard work being a cow. So they're having a bit of a sit down, bit of a rest. A nice little group of foxgloves here. Rather an attractive flower. Slightly going over these ones. And we'll cut back into the woodland here. Fairly vocal parakeet there. There's a nuthatch calling there. Sort of drip, 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 drip note. Rather an attractive little bird, the nuthatch. Sort of subtle blues and oranges, and it tends to creep up or down the trunks of trees. It'll often also grab an acorn or some sort of nut that it wants to eat and wedge it into a crevice in the bark to hold it so it can tap away and eat, get to the tasty stuff inside. Right, which way to go from here? I think we will go to have a look in the paddock. Wander through some of the grassland habitat to end, so we'll cut through the other end of the wood. There's a magpie just flew up off the path. Cut through the other end of the wood, and then we'll walk back through the grass and see what is flying. It was fairly decent for butterflies earlier on in here when it was sunnier. It's cooler and duller now, so let's see what we see. There's the remnants of the wild garlic. It was flowering a lot earlier. Still some leaves there. So we're cut over into this grassland that you can see just ahead of us over this stile. And this meadow we graze later in the year, so this hasn't had the cows in yet. Hence the much longer grass. But they'll be coming in here at some point later in the year to help control the grass in this meadow and support the different flowers that grow here. At the moment there are a lot of buttercups, which you can see here growing up in this meadow. There's also quite a bit of clover. This is not a very good example of clover. We'll find a better one in a minute. There's a few more clover here, rather nicer condition. Let's have a look. Rather a nice plant clover. Not at all unusual, of course, but nevertheless very nice, and little bits of it all through this meadow. Another really important plant. I did a broadcast earlier in the month about this. This is yellow rattle. Not yet rattling particularly, but this is a important plant for maintaining wildflower meadows because it is what they call hemiparasitic on grasses. So it draws some of its nutrients by stealing the nutrients from the grasses around it. And so having this in the meadow keeps the grass less abundant, less robust, and that gives more space for other plants, other flowering plants. So it's quite an important little bit of a wildflower meadow in many cases, having this yellow rattle here. And when it's a bit more mature and the seed pods have dried slightly, it rattles when you shake it like this, which is the origin of the name. butterfly there. See if it'll settle down. Gonna stop. Okay, it's settled down. I'm pretty sure it was a meadow brown. It seemed to settle about here. Let's try and get a bit. Yeah, it is a meadow brown. Very common butterfly. Can be super abundant, really. Hundreds, thousands of them in these meadows. Later in the year, they're just in the first few weeks of their emergence at the moment. So not vast numbers, and it says they're rather cooler and duller, so everything's quite inactive. So even the ones that are here, unless you happen to stumble across them, they'll often be rather settled down. Oh, I think meadow brown is a rather attractive butterfly. Even though later in the year I will be seeing them in incredibly vast numbers in here. There's another one. At least two. See, it's settled. See if we can get a bit closer without disturbing it. Or too close, it will fly off, and certainly if I disturb the grasses that it's near, it'll flit. Not the most brightly coloured thing, although the orange on the upper wings can flash quite effectively. And it's got false eyes on the wing, you can just see peeking out the top there. Again, are probably twofold, partly to look like the eyes of something and possibly scare off a predator, and partly also to draw attacks towards that part of the wing. And they can cope with the odd hole in the wing, but if something attacks their real head and their real eyes, they don't tend to do very well with their heads bitten off. So those false eyes are a useful feature. There's lots more of the yellow rattle there, and another plant here. This is one of the ragwort, probably common ragwort, although we do have, I think it's hoary ragwort, which is a rarer one in here. This is a plant that is poisonous to various animals, and it has a moth associated with called the cinnabar, which, as a caterpillar, feeds on this plant, and collects the toxins from the plant and builds them into its own body, so that it becomes toxic, and that's how it protects itself. Slightly early for the caterpillars to be out just yet. Later in the year, they'll be easy to find on the ragwort because they're toxic. They don't bother particularly camouflaging themselves or trying to hide away. If anything, they like to advertise how present they are and let things know they're there and poisonous. There's some of the ragwort just starting to come into flower. I just want to focus on that, but there we go. So we're coming back to our starting point now. You can see the bluebell centre that we set out from just ahead. Wander through the meadow, see if there's anything else to see as we go down, and then there's at least one bit of survey apparatus that I want to have a look at whilst we're here. Several more meadow brown butterflies flushing up, so even in the relatively dull and cool conditions, they do fly. There's another one. Flitting around ahead of us. We're perched up. Let's see if we can have a look at this one as well. I think it's aware of me. It's sort of backing away as if it doesn't wish to be seen. Never mind. Here's what I was going to check. So, if anyone's been following these broadcasts will have seen a few of these things. This is a clearwing moth lure, a pheromone trap, and it contains in the top there, under that white lid, a plastic bung which contains a synthetic version of the pheromone produced by the females of a particular species of moth. In this case, the six-belted clearwing. And what that can do, that can attract the males who come to investigate what they think is a female, and they drop into the container here. So we're going to have a look and see if we've got any. I'm not particularly hopeful given the dull conditions, but you never know. Well, on first glance I can't see anything. Just give me a second to open this up. Nothing on there. And nothing in there. So no success with six-belted clearwing, unfortunately. It's a shame. It's an attractive moth. It does occur here. I think it'd been a warmer day, we'd probably have found some. But you have to do these surveys when you've got the time. And the weekend is convenient for me, so I did put that out. Bit of a long shot it would work, and it pretty much didn't. Right, we're pretty much back now to where we started. Back at the Bluebell Centre, our visitor centre, classroom, education facility. Now coming back to life with all the COVID restrictions having been lifted, and we're able to get the schools back in. And Nicola, who runs our schools programme, is increasingly busy, which I think is a very good thing. We're getting lots of children through and really sort of introducing them to understanding nature and the world around them. So with that's largely a nice little wander around. We've seen some interesting plants, some interesting butterflies. We've seen a moth that came out of a pupa that I found, so all stuff to have a look at. And that'll do for today's little bit of 30 Days Wild.